In 1654, a French mathematician sat down with a gambling problem, and by the time he was done, he had built the framework that Wall Street would eventually use to price risk. And then he turned that same framework on the question of God. Most people think they already know what happened next. Pascal's wager, the argument religious people use when they've run out of better arguments. Bet on God, because you have nothing to lose. Except that's not what Pascal said, not even close. And the gap between what he actually argued and what gets attributed to him is where something genuinely surprising lives. Something that has less to do with religion than it does with the mathematics of how rational people make decisions under uncertainty. A discipline that didn't have a name yet in 1654, because Pascal was in the middle of inventing it. Here's what this video is going to do. It's going to walk you through the actual argument, the four-outcome matrix Pascal constructed, the expected value logic behind it, the mathematical proof that refusing to engage the question is not a neutral position, but a wager in its own right, and probably the worst one available. And then it's going to show you something that almost no one who talks about this argument bothers to go back and read. What Pascal himself said about what the math could and couldn't do. That last part is the one worth staying for. Let's start in the summer of 1654, not with God, but with dice. A French nobleman and professional gambler named the Chevalier de Marais had a problem. He'd been winning consistently on one type of bet, wagering that a 6 would appear at least once in 4 rolls of a die, and then he switched to a variation he thought was equivalent, betting that a double 6 would appear at least once in 24 rolls of 2 dice. He started losing. He couldn't figure out why the math wasn't behaving the way his intuition said it should. So he brought the problem to Blaise Pascal. Pascal was 30 years old, already famous across Europe for inventing one of the first mechanical calculators at age 19. He took the problem seriously, began corresponding with another French mathematician named Pierre de Fermat, and over the course of that summer, the two of them worked out the foundational principles of probability theory. The problem of points, how to fairly divide stakes in a game that gets interrupted before it finishes, became the seedbed for the entire discipline of calculating expected outcomes under uncertainty. The answer to the Chevalier's question, by the way, is that a 6 appearing at least once in 4 rolls gives you slightly better than even odds. A double 6 appearing in 24 rolls gives you slightly less than even odds. The intuition that the two bets were equivalent was mathematically wrong, and Pascal could now prove exactly why. This matters for what comes next. When Pascal eventually turned this same analytical apparatus on the question of God, he wasn't doing theology. He was doing what he'd been doing all summer, calculating expected outcomes under conditions of genuine uncertainty. The tools were the same, the stakes were just somewhat higher. Now, the argument you've probably heard goes like this: bet on God. If you're right, you win heaven. If you're wrong, you lose nothing. So what's the risk? This is the popular compression of the wager, and it's been repeated so many times that it's become the official version in most people's heads, both by people who find it persuasive and by people who think it's intellectually embarrassing. The atheist rebuttal almost always targets this version. You're assuming it's only your God or no God, but what about all the other gods? What if you bet on the wrong one? That's a fair objection to the popular compression. It is not a fair objection to what Pascal actually wrote. In the Pensées, the collection of fragments that weren't published until after his death, fragment 418 contains the wager. And it does not open with, "You have nothing to lose." It opens with this: God is or he is not. But to which side shall we incline? Reason can decide nothing here. There is an infinite chaos which separates us. A game is being played at the extremity of this infinite distance where heads or tails will turn up. Stop there for a moment. Notice what Pascal is doing before the argument even starts. He is not asserting that God exists. He is not claiming that faith is obvious. He is acknowledging that reason, on its own, cannot settle this question. The two possibilities, God exists, God does not exist, are genuinely open as far as rational analysis is concerned. He is being more honest about the limits of philosophical proof than most people who talk about this argument bother to be. Then the interlocutor in Pascal's dialogue pushes back. If reason can't decide, why bet at all? Why not just stay out of it? And this is where the argument actually begins. Because Pascal's response is not, "Here's why God exists." His response is, "Staying out of it is not an option. Here is the matrix, the actual one. There are two variables, what you choose to do, commit to the possibility of God or decline to, and what turns out to be true, God exists or God does not exist. That gives you 4 possible outcomes. Outcome 1. You commit, and God exists. Pascal says you gain everything, an infinity of infinitely happy life. In his phrase, the expected value here is infinite. Outcome 2. You commit, and God does not exist. You've spent your life oriented around something that turns out not to be there. You lose a finite amount, certain pleasures, certain freedoms, a version of your life organized differently. The expected value is a finite loss. Outcome 3. You decline, and God does not exist. You've lost nothing by not committing. The expected value is 0, or perhaps a modest finite gain if the life you lived felt freer. Outcome 4. You decline, and God exists. You've declined infinite gain in exchange for that same modest finite comfort. Now run the expected value calculation Pascal actually runs. Even if the probability that God exists is very small, even if you think it's vanishingly unlikely, the asymmetry of the outcomes obliterates that probability in the math. An infinitely small chance at infinite gain when properly weighted still outweighs a certainty of finite gain. This is not a rhetorical trick. This is the mathematics of expected value, the same framework that governs how insurance companies price policies and how investors think about tail risks. Pascal was applying the tools he'd built that summer with Fermat. The many gods objection, which is the strongest objection to this argument, is a real complication. Pascal was aware that he was not providing a decision procedure for which God to bet on, only that some commitment to the transcendent was mathematically preferable to none. That's a narrower claim than his critics usually attack, and a more defensible one. But here's the part that most people never get to. Most summaries of the wager end with the 4 squares and a conclusion, therefore believe. Pascal doesn't end there. He keeps going. And what he says next is the part that changes everything. This is a reasonable moment to tell you about something that lives in the description below this video. It's called The Wrecked Interior, Pascal's Guide to Spiritual Dryness, and it's a 5-lesson mini-course that walks through what Pascal diagnosed as the deeper condition underneath the intellectual questions, the going through the motions experience that most practicing Christians carry privately and almost never name out loud. If the math in this video has started to open something, if you find yourself recognizing that the question is more urgent than you'd been willing to admit, that's exactly the territory the course is built for. The link is in the description. Back to the fragment. Pascal's interlocutor, after the 4-square demonstration, concedes the logic. The math checks out. But then he says something honest. I can see that the argument is correct, and I still cannot force myself to believe. The calculation doesn't produce faith. He knows what the odds say. He can't make the interior experience follow from the intellectual conclusion. Pascal's response to this is not to produce more math. He expected this objection. He built it into the argument. His response is, of course the calculation doesn't produce belief directly. That's not what it's for. What it's for is this. It removes the pretense that not choosing is safe. Listen to what Pascal writes in the same fragment. You must wager. It is not optional. You are embarked. You are embarked. Not, you should consider embarking. Not, here is an invitation to embark. You are already in the boat. The game is already in progress. Every day that you live is a day in which you are acting out of some set of assumptions about whether ultimate things are real or not. Spending your time, arranging your attention, deciding what matters, and those actions constitute a wager, whether you have consciously placed one or not. The person who says I'm keeping the question open is already betting. They're betting on outcome 3, that the safer, more comfortable life arranged around finite things is the right allocation of the one life they have. That is a wager. It just hasn't been examined as one. What Pascal's matrix does is not produce faith. It destroys the illusion of neutrality. It makes visible the bet you were already making in the dark. And then something happened to Pascal that no probability matrix could have predicted. The night of November 23rd, 1654. Pascal was 31 years old. He had been through a near-fatal carriage accident a few weeks earlier. The horses went over a bridge. The carriage hung at the edge. Pascal survived. Something shifted in him during those weeks. And then, on that November night, for approximately 2 hours, from roughly 10:30 in the evening until 12:30, something occurred that he spent the rest of the night trying to write down. The piece of paper was found sewn into the lining of his coat after his death. He had transferred it from coat to coat for 8 years. It begins with a single word: fire. Then, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and scholars. Certainty, certainty, feeling, joy, peace. The man who had built the mathematics of probability, who had just spent years constructing rational frameworks for decision-making under uncertainty, was recording an encounter that his own frameworks had no category for. Not an argument, not a calculation. Fire. This is the thing that the academic treatments of the wager almost always miss, and that the apologetics treatments handle awkwardly. Pascal knew, he said so in fragment 418, that the math was not going to produce what the memorial described. The wager was designed to remove a blockage, the false comfort of thinking you haven't made a choice. What came through when the blockage was removed was not more mathematics. He wrote, in the Pensées, about what he called the 3 orders, 3 irreducible categories of human experience and value: the order of the body, the order of the mind, and the order of charity, which he also called the order of love. The orders don't reduce to each other. Intellectual greatness cannot be perceived by someone operating only in the bodily order. And the order of charity, what the memorial was pointing at, cannot be reached by intellectual greatness alone. Pascal was not anti-intellectual. He was one of the most powerful intellects of the 17th century. He was saying something more precise, that the mind, at its best, can clear the ground. It cannot plant what grows there. The wager belongs to the order of the mind. It is Pascal's most rigorous intellectual gift to the person who has been pretending the question isn't urgent. It is a proof that the pretense is mathematically indefensible. But Pascal knew, because he had built the whole machine and still needed the fire, that the proof was not the destination. There is a line from fragment 418 that almost never gets quoted in the standard treatments. After the expected value argument, after the response to the interlocutor's objection about not being able to force belief, Pascal says this: "Learn from those who have been bound like you and who now wager all they have. Follow the way by which they began, by acting as if they believed, taking the holy water, having masses said, etc. Even this will naturally make you believe and will dull your acuteness. This has been read as a cynical move. Fake it until you make it religious edition. That misses the architecture." Pascal is not recommending intellectual dishonesty. He is applying the same probabilistic intuition he'd been using all along. That repeated action shapes the patterns of response. That the will is not changed by argument alone, but by the reorientation of habit. That the person who acts as if the bet is real will discover, through the acting, something the argument alone could not deliver. It is a kind of behavioral expected value reasoning applied to the interior life. And it is a complete theory of how transformation actually happens. Not through a single moment of intellectual capitulation, but through a slow reorientation of what you do with your time, your attention, your practice, until the doing becomes, eventually, a kind of knowing. Here's what you actually walked away from in a lot of conversations about Pascal's wager. You walked away from the popular version, the Nothing to Lose consolation prize, and concluded the argument was weak. That was a fair response to that version. The actual version is harder to dismiss, not because it's religious, but because it's mathematically serious. The expected value asymmetry is real. The case that neutrality is itself a wager is airtight. The observation that you are already embarked, that every day of living constitutes a bet on what matters, is not a rhetorical move. It is the application of a framework Pascal built, specifically to reveal what common sense was hiding. The question the wager leaves you with is not, do you believe in God? Pascal was clear that the argument couldn't settle that. The question it leaves you with is narrower and more uncomfortable. Have you looked at the bet you're already making? Because if you haven't, if the assumption underneath your daily life has never been examined, if you've been living in outcome 3 while telling yourself you're keeping the question open, then the Chevalier de Marais' problem is yours too. The intuition says the bet is equivalent, the math says it isn't, and Pascal built the tools to prove it. He also built a coat with a hidden pocket. And what he kept in it was not a theorem. If the mathematical argument in this video opened something, if you found yourself less sure than you expected that you'd examine the real question, there's a deeper layer waiting. The 5-lesson mini-course, Direct Interior, walks through Pascal's diagnosis of the interior condition that usually underlies the intellectual deflection. The hollow faith, the practiced motions that stopped connecting to anything, the private going through the motions that most long-term believers carry without a name for it. Pascal mapped that territory with more precision than almost anyone who came after him. The course is in the link below. And if you've ever sat with the feeling that you've been keeping a question officially open while already answering it with how you spend your days, tell me when you first noticed that.